Sometimes life pushes a person so far into the cold that even hope begins to shiver. On a freezing winter night in the snow-covered streets of Colorado, a little girl stood trembling outside a bakery. Her clothes were torn, her feet bare, and her hands empty except for courage. Holding her long golden hair, she whispered to the baker, "If I cut off my hair, will you give me some bread?" The baker glanced at her with disdain and shook his head. Then came the sound of heavy boots behind her. A tall, rugged man with a weathered face stood there. His name was Elias Gray, a lonely mountain hunter. He looked into the girl's eyes and said quietly, "Keep your hair, child. I'll give you the bread and a home." From that moment on, that freezing night changed both of their lives forever. Elias lifted the trembling girl into his wagon and wrapped her in his fur coat. She was light as a feather, and he could feel the cold biting through her thin frame. "What's your name, little one?" he asked gently as the horses began to move. "Clara," she whispered, still clutching the small piece of bread he'd bought for her. "My mama, she went to heaven last winter. I tried to find work, but nobody wanted me. I thought maybe my hair was worth something." Elias's jaw tightened. He'd lived alone in the mountains for years, far from the greed and cruelty of townsfolk. But something about this child, her quiet strength, her attempt to trade beauty for survival, stirred a long-buried ache in his chest. He nodded slowly and said, "You won't need to trade anything anymore, Clara. You've got a home now, up in the mountains with me." The trail up to Elias's cabin was rough and blanketed in snow. The wind howled through the pines, but Clara didn't complain once. She sat quietly beside him, her small hands tucked beneath the coat he'd wrapped around her. When they reached the clearing, the girl's eyes widened. The cabin stood sturdy and warm against the grey wilderness, smoke curling from the chimney like a promise. Elias lifted her down and opened the door. Inside, the room glowed with the orange light of a wood fire. "It's not much," he muttered, "but it'll keep us alive." Clara stepped inside and stared at the shelves of dried herbs, the hanging pelts, and the old rocking chair by the fire. "It's beautiful," she said softly. For the first time in years, Elias smiled. He set a pot of stew on the stove, ladled some into a bowl, and handed it to her. She ate slowly, tears mixing with the steam. Watching her, Elias realized it had been a long time since anyone had shared a meal in his cabin, and even longer since it had felt like home. Later that night, the storm outside grew fierce, rattling the shutters and howling through the trees. Elias sat near the fire, whittling a piece of pine into the shape of a bird, while Clara watched from under a wool blanket. She had finished her stew, and now fought sleep with the stubbornness only the hungry and frightened possess. When she finally drifted off, Elias laid another log on the fire and looked at her. This small, fragile thing who had appeared out of nowhere, offering to trade her hair for bread. Her dark curls spilled over the blanket, and for a moment she reminded him of his late daughter, lost years ago to fever. His chest tightened at the memory, the kind of pain that time dulled but never erased. Outside, the snow fell thicker, silencing the wilderness. Inside, for the first time in many winters, Elias felt something stir in his heart, not sorrow, but purpose. Tomorrow, he decided, he would go into town and speak to the preacher about finding the girl a future. But deep down, as the firelight flickered over his weathered face, he already knew he wasn't going to let her go. By morning, the storm had buried the cabin beneath a blanket of white, the kind that muffled every sound and made the world seem gentler than it was. Elias rose before dawn, as he always did, and lit the stove again, careful not to wake Clara. The girl was curled up by the hearth, clutching the small wooden bird he'd carved for her the night before. Her face, soft in the glow of the fire, no longer looked haunted, just tired and young. When she awoke, Elias handed her a tin cup of warm milk and smiled faintly. "Ain't much, but it's something," he said. Clara's hands trembled as she took it. "Thank you, Mr. Elias. Nobody's ever been this kind to me before." Her voice cracked at the edges. But there was wonder in it too, the kind that comes from realizing that not everyone in the world means harm. As she drank, Elias packed his old sled with supplies. "We'll head to town once the wind settles," he said. "There's work to be done, and a roof's no good unless there's bread on the table." Clara looked up at him, snowlight catching in her eyes. "Can I stay with you?"
"For a while?"
she asked hesitantly. Elias paused, his rough hands tightening around the rope of the sled. He'd built his life around silence and solitude, but looking at her now, small, brave, and still believing in kindness, he felt something shift deep inside him. "For a while," he said quietly, nodding once. "We'll see what the good Lord has planned." And as the morning sun broke over the mountains, painting the world in gold, Elias Cain, the man who had long ago shut the world out, found himself opening his door once more, not just to a child in need, but to the fragile. Healing warmth of hope. Days turned into weeks, and the rhythm of life in Elias's cabin began to change. Where there had once been only the creak of wood and the whisper of wind, there was now laughter, soft and hesitant at first, then bright and alive. Clara followed Elias through his chores, learning to stack firewood, mend traps, and knead dough beside the stove. Her cheeks filled out, her hair grew shinier, and for the first time in years, Elias found himself talking again, really talking, telling stories of the old trails, the bears he'd hunted, the rivers he'd crossed. One evening, as the snow melted into spring, Clara placed a small loaf of bread on the table, her first real bake, and smiled proudly. Elias took a bite, nodding with mock seriousness before breaking into a grin. "You've outdone yourself, little lady," he said. Her laughter filled the cabin like music, but not all change comes without shadow. One afternoon, a rider came down the path, a stranger from town carrying a sheriff's badge and a folded poster. Elias stepped outside, suspicion hardening his face. The man looked past him, toward the window where Clara watched nervously. "That girl," the sheriff said quietly. "She's been missing for near 2 months. Folks been looking for her." Elias felt his stomach twist. He turned back toward Clara, who stood frozen, her small hands gripping the windowsill. "Is that true, Clara?" he asked softly. Tears welled in her eyes as she nodded. "I ran away," she whispered, "from the man who hurt me. I couldn't go back there." For a long moment, Elias didn't move. The wind swept through the valley, cold and sharp, carrying with it the weight of choice. He could hand her over, let the law decide her fate, or he could do what his heart told him was right. Finally, he looked the sheriff square in the eye and said, "Then I reckon she ain't missing anymore. She's home." The sheriff's expression softened, but duty pulled at his conscience. "Elias," he said quietly, "you know I can't just leave her here without asking questions." The mountain man's jaw tightened, his hand unconsciously brushing the worn rifle by the door, not in threat, but in silent resolve. "Then ask what you need to," Elias replied, voice steady as the timber beams above them. Inside, Clara stood trembling, torn between fear and trust. She had known hunger, cruelty, and the cold indifference of strangers, but not this. Not the quiet protection in the eyes of a man who asked nothing in return. "Please," she whispered to the sheriff, stepping forward. "He didn't do nothing wrong. He just gave me bread and a bed by the fire." The sheriff removed his hat, scratching his head with a sigh. "Girl, the law's meant to keep you safe." But truth be told, the law don't always do that. He glanced around the cabin, the tidy hearth, the drying herbs, the small loaf cooling on the counter. Signs of a home built on kindness, not crime. Finally, he nodded once. "All right, Elias, I didn't see her here. You keep her safe, you hear?" Elias's shoulders eased, a quiet gratitude passing through his weathered features. "She's safe," he promised. As the sheriff rode off into the fading dusk, the mountains swallowed the sound of hoofbeats, leaving behind only the hush of the valley. That night, Clara sat beside Elias by the fire, the flames painting her face in gold. "You didn't have to protect me," she murmured. Elias looked into the fire, then at her. "Maybe not," he said softly. "But sometimes a man finds family where he least expects it." And for the first time in years, as snow fell softly outside, Elias Harper, The mountain man who had once chosen solitude felt his cabin wasn't empty anymore.